Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Votteler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas Water Journal. You can sign up for Texas+Water by visiting Texas+Water.org, and you can sign up for the Texas Water Journal at TexasWaterJournal.org. Both publications are free. My guest today is Dr. Sharon Megdal. She is the director of the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center in Tucson, Arizona. Sharon, welcome and thank you for being part of Talk+Water.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So let's start out with your background in water. How did you first become involved with water issues?
Well, Todd, that's an interesting question for me to answer, and I don't think we have enough time to go into all the details, but my career's taken some interesting twists and turns, and in fact, I did not start out ever thinking I would be involved in water in the southwestern United States. I grew up in New Jersey. I did my education at Rutgers University and then Princeton for my PhD in economics, where I specialized in applied microeconomics and econometrics, which is statistical analysis that economists do. And I moved out for my first job to Arizona in the Department of Economics. And it wasn't until several years later when I was lucky enough to be appointed to the Arizona Corporation Commission, Arizona's utility regulatory body, by then Governor Bruce Babbitt, that I really became exposed to water issues through regulating privately owned water companies. And then things took off from there and cascaded such that I became a consultant to some water utilities, but most importantly, I became the executive director to a regional water augmentation district in the early 90s. And that's really where I got my feet wet. And ever since then, I've been involved in water very intensively. I came back to the University of Arizona in the early 2000s to the Water Resources Research Center, and it's been a love affair ever since. But it really has been a circuitous route, not a traditional route, and here I am.
Well, with your foundation in economics, that was maybe somewhat unusual back then for somebody to get into kind of the water community and be focused on water, maybe not as unusual today. How did that help you along the way?
The economics training helped along the way because economics, if nothing else, provides you with a framework for thinking about things and questioning things. And so my focus has been on water management decision-making and water policy. And so when you think about questions and analysis of any type of policy, tax policy, government expenditure policy, which happen to be the two areas that I focused on as a graduate student and first out of graduate school, it's very similar to issues of rate making for utilities. It's also very relevant to how water managers, water users make decisions. So my training has been very, very useful. But as I like to say, I don't write in Greek letters anymore. And anybody who's had graduate training in economics knows why I'm saying that. My work nowadays is very applied. But the training really, really helps. Why do we see one thing happening versus another? What are the potential advantages and disadvantages of different policy options? Those are the kinds of things I looked at as an economist proper, as I might say. And then the water is just one additional area of applied economics. I will say that for years and years, individuals have studied natural resource economics, agricultural economics. Land-grant universities have had programs in that for years and years, but that's not how I got my training. Really, what I did is connect my more traditional neoclassical economics to the water world through application and a lot of on the ground and on the job learning.
And now the hot topic, it seems, is always water markets. And so it sounds in many ways like, the water community is kind of coming to the conclusion that, hey, economics is really the way to think about water management in the future, much more than maybe we have in the past.
In fact, that's a good point that you've made there, because as a graduate student and in my early work, I looked at what's called market failure or imperfect markets, which is what you really see in transactions dealing with many kinds of public goods and services. In Economics 101, you study what is a market and how do they work. And it's based on assumptions, lots of buyers, lots of sellers. That's not typically what we see in water markets. So understanding how transactions can occur and the potential, and when are you dealing with multiple buyers and sellers or single buyer or seller in the water world, it's very relevant. So yes, water markets are really an important aspect of how we approach some of the problems we're facing. But you almost have to look at every circumstance individually, because they don't resemble what you learn about in Economics 101.
So I have to ask you about wicked water problems. I hear that phrase a lot, and usually your name's connected to it. So can you tell us what wicked water problems are?
I'd be happy to, Todd. And I need to give credit here at the outset to Lisa Butler, who's from California, a consultant with Stantec, and a colleague of mine on the board of the American Water Resources Association. And I had gotten to know Lisa over a number of years, and we invited Lisa to come to one of the Water Resources Research Center's annual conferences and give an opening keynote speech. And she spoke about the concept of wicked water problems, and the audience found it very intriguing. We got great positive feedback. So then we asked Lisa, how about writing a column for us for our newsletter? And she did. And it's really the basics that she explained in that column that have been so useful to me as I've tried to frame wicked water problems and talk about them, because there's a long history of philosophical literature about wicked problems. And what Lisa helped me do, and I've been trying to maybe help others do, is use that context to analyze water problems. And the main thing, if there's a single thing to remember about wicked water problems, it's that there's not a single solution to them. They're complex, they're multifaceted, and what you really have to talk about is identifying pathways to solutions, because there's no single shot, single option that's going to fix the issue or resolve the issue. And what Lisa pointed out, and I think we all agree when we think about some of the water problems as contributing factors or characteristic factors, is that these are problems about which there's incomplete or contradictory knowledge. The number of people and opinions may be very large. There may be large economic burden associated with them, and they're interconnected with other issues. And so it may be, how do you facilitate growth? It's a bigger issue than water, but that affects water provision. And geopolitical issues can come in. And so these are issues that require a team of and a long-term approach, a team of people and a long-term approach to address. And as I said, they're going to keep us busy for a very long time because they're not just solved. Right.
That, that tells me that, that's really the kind of problem the Edwards Aquifer issue was for decades. What wicked water problem right now in the United States are you focused on, and do you think is kind of the poster child for wicked water problems?
Well, I'll talk about one first, but if you'll indulge me, I might just want to mention a couple of others that are related. So I live in Arizona. I'm in Tucson, Arizona. Arizona is part of the Colorado River Basin. Close to 40% of the water supplies used in the state annually come from the Colorado River, either along the main stem, which forms the western boundary of the state, or through the constructed Central Arizona Project, which is a huge constructed project, taking water from the river, pumping it uphill to Phoenix, and then further uphill to Tucson and a little bit beyond Tucson. And I would say the Colorado River Basin is iconic. It's known around the world for multiple reasons. And the wicked water problem, if I would have to identify one, is the imbalance between demand and supply of water. If you look at the basin, there are 7 states. Several of them are rapidly growing states. Water is conveyed outside of the hydrologic boundaries so that Southern California, for example, Denver and other major cities are out of the hydrologic boundaries. They're rapidly growing and using the water. We've got Mexico to the south. There's a treaty obligation to deliver 1.5 million acre feet of water annually to Mexico. There's vibrant agricultural communities in the basin. And we knew this before, but there was an effort to actually quantify this as best as one can through projections and modeling. The Bureau of Reclamation and the states put together a study that was completed in 2012. I believe it was the first water smart basin study that was started under the water smart legislation. And it showed a tremendous deficit, that demand would continue to outpace supply in the basin over the period. I believe the study went through 2060. And this is an issue. Although there are other supplies that can be relied on in the region, the Colorado River is an important source of water. So this imbalance between supply and demand is a wicked water problem because there is no one solution. Conservation is important. That won't resolve it. Augmentation could be done. That won't resolve it. Transactions through water markets may help. That won't resolve it. Desalination, all these things are potential options for addressing the problem. But we have a situation where even if the hydrology of the basin were good, and we've been in a 20-plus year of drought or below average flows in most of those 20 years, even if we were experiencing average flows, we have what's called a structural deficit in the lower basin. In other words, the water that's been allocated to Arizona, Nevada, and California, the 3 lower basin states, exceeds what could be expected to come in an average year over time when we're below average because of climate change, that's changing climate, whatever words people want to use to describe that. So that's a huge, huge wicked water problem that takes a lot of time on the part of decision makers. The federal government, of course, this is a Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Interior project. We've got an Upper Basin Commission. We've got the Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam. We've got the Lower Basin states. So we've got 7 states, all of the parties within the states, the federal government with Bureau of Reclamation in the lead, the Republic of Mexico. We've got tribal nations who are sovereign when it comes to water management and hold rights to significant quantities of Colorado River water. All of these people and entities are in the mix of trying to work on these problems. But the good news is that we make progress. We're identifying, let's say, pathways, options for dealing with it but it's iterative. It's iterative. It goes on and on. So if I may, in 2007, the Secretary of the Interior promulgated what are called the interim shortage sharing guidelines. The Hoover Dam was completed in the 1930s. Water's been used, from time immemorial from the Colorado River, but we didn't have any options for sharing shortages. So in 2007, after years of dialogue and debate, the Secretary of Interior adopted shortage sharing guidelines that were called interim because they were only expected to carry through the year 2026. Now, interestingly, through 2018, a shortage never had to be declared because of some years of good hydrology in there, the fact that the storage reservoirs started out kind of full in about 2000. And so we were relying on the savings account of water and storage in a few good years. But the hydrology was not improving. The weather was not improving. So in 2018, it looked bleak to be able to avoid shortage. And this is where Arizona has a paramount interest in avoiding shortage, because the Central Arizona project, that constructed project that brings water from the river into Central Arizona, is low priority compared to California, particularly California, which has a large allocation of lower basin water. And so in order to avoid an overall, I'll use the very technical term, crash of the system, the parties came together and looked at what can we do to deal with this continued drought, and developed programs called drought contingency plans, one for the upper basin, one for the lower basin. Some agreements with Mexico were developed. And in 2019, this was all completed through federal legislation and signings. And so we have a way of avoiding a crash of the system through an overlay of these drought contingency plans. But the work is already starting on what do we do? What do we have in place post 2026? So this iterative, intensive, continuous process or processes are going on to address this very wicked problem of the imbalance that's both due to growing demands and also reduced supplies due to hydrology and climate impacts. And then this has reverberations. So, for example, this whole situation that I described for you has implications for agriculture in central Arizona, particularly the region between Tucson and Phoenix. And so they're dealing with curtailments in supplies of surface water, and they're looking to go back on pumping groundwater in what is already an overdrafted aquifer. And so how do you deal with that wicked problem of wanting to continue vibrant agricultural economies and their communities that are growing their municipal populations? So that's maybe a sub-wicked water problem to this broader wicked water problem. And there are others that I could talk about, but maybe I'd like to just mention two very briefly, and that is water for natural systems. In the state of Arizona in particular, and in other areas, there are not state laws, let's say, recognizing natural systems as users of water, except for some exception. And then there are issues that particularly are affecting some of the native nations with lack of water infrastructure, access to clean water, sanitation. These are but a few examples, but they're all part of the Colorado River Basin, and many are for areas beyond as well.
So, I mean, obviously, I'm from Texas. If anybody's actually listening to this show, I guess I should preface it by saying that, if have listened to any of the 25 or so episodes before this one. And I went to school in Tennessee at Sewanee, where this is the first time I read Aldo Leopold's San County Almanac. And so I remember reading the part about the Delta, the Colorado Delta, when he goes down to the Colorado Delta, and I was thinking, well, where is that? I mean, does that place even exist anymore? And it still exists, but it's just a remnant of what it was, isn't it?
It is a remnant of the physical lands are still there, but the Colorado River is a highly managed river. And so the water is dammed and developed in the United States. When it hits Mexico, Mexico diverts it to the west for use by farming and communities west of the Yuma area, the basically southwestern border of the Colorado River, where it intersects with the border with Mexico. And so the water does not flow south of the border and hasn't flowed with any regularity in quite some time. And so the condition of the Delta is of high interest to many. And I mentioned as one of the wicked water problems, the consideration of water for natural systems. And the Delta is a system. It's a huge system. And I sometimes like to tell this quick story that I'll tell when I talk about this. And that is in 2014, the federal and state parties in Mexico all got together and agreed to do a pulse flow to see what would happen if, in fact, water were allowed to flow south as it would naturally instead of all being diverted. And this was a great effort. And in March of 2014, I didn't have the privilege of being there to see it, but water actually flowed south instead of all being diverted. And it gave the researchers opportunities to study the implications and what a pulse flow would do, because historically pulses happen, right, through flooding and so forth. And a beautiful documentary was made, which I'm not going to be able to remember the name of it at the moment, but if somebody looks at Colorado River documentary narrated by Robert Redford, they'll find it on YouTube. And it talks about the pulse flow, and it shows what joy the pulse flow gave to the children and the people who were able to walk into a river that actually had water in it instead of just sand. And the story part of it is back in after that pulse flow, I had the opportunity to give a talk about the Colorado River at a workshop in Israel addressing some of the issues of the lower Jordan River. And I showed the first 5 minutes of that 10-minute documentary. And I stopped it at the point at which there's a beautiful 5 or 6 year old girl with a big smile on her face in the water. And I have people who have come up to me in the last year or two when I've been over in the Middle East, and they say, Sharon, I remember that presentation. That was such a great presentation. And you know what, Todd? I have to say, it might have been a good presentation, but the reason they remember it is because of the video that I showed and that little girl's face, the joy that water in the river brought to people.
That's great. That's great. So I want to shift to the East. Recently, I gave an interview to a magazine that was publishing an article about Mississippi versus Tennessee, the fight over the Memphis Sand Aquifer, or I guess it's the Sparta, depending on what side of that fight you're on. And I thought I said, hey, we're seeing water conflicts increasing and expanding from the western United States to the eastern United States. And the article said, I said that they were shifting. And I said, we still have them in the West. I think it's just expanding. And so I'm interested, what lessons do you think that the eastern states could learn from the experience of the western states now that they are encountering these wicked water problems with greater frequency?
I guess there are a few lessons that I would suggest, and I would imagine that many of them have learned the lessons, but I'll mention them nevertheless. And that is, you can't count on things staying the same. So you have to be prepared. And it's funny, this concept of be prepared. My office, the Water Resources Research Center, is located slightly off campus at the University of Arizona, and we're in the old Boy Scouts building. And on the outside of our building is the emblem and motto of the Boy Scouts, which is be prepared. And I point out that that's a good motto for an organization, a center working on water issues. You've got to be prepared. And it's impossible to be prepared for everything. But the other example that I think of, and unfortunately I can never quite remember the name of the rivers and so forth, but the Atlanta situation where they were down to under 30 days of water because the reservoir, the lake that collects the surface water, was running so low because of a drought, a very dry period. So whether it's dealing with groundwater, the invisible water that doesn't follow political jurisdictions when it flows, right? It flows to where it is, and it can be looked at as a common pool resource. What one uses is no longer there for another user. Whether it's surface water, where you're depending upon nature, you have to look at what are the factors that can affect the resilience of the supply. And so we just have to be prepared for changing conditions, growth, changing climate conditions, the like. And we also have to think about our processes for working through some of these issues. And I remember an example where I had the opportunity to be invited to a workshop in Orlando, Florida, about Orlando's issues of the Floridian aquifer, I believe, where it's a huge, huge aquifer. Many are reliant on it. They're also reliant on surface water. But the surface water laws have required e-flows or environmental flows. So you can't keep pumping it. The governance structure will not allow you to pump those rivers dry through kind of discharge because of overpumping of aquifers. And so one of the lessons that I've learned is that when considering what to do about some of these problems, not all of them, the solution set has a lot of commonality. So in Florida, reusing treated wastewater is part of the solution set. That's a huge part of the solution set in water scarce areas of the southwestern United States. And if you follow what's going on in California, where typically all the treated wastewater was flowing, or most of it, into the ocean, now there are major projects to capture it. So even though I like to talk about water rich and water scarce areas, it seems like everybody's got some problems with water or others, and it may be flooding, and we have flooding in water scarce areas too, right? But it may be flooding, maybe water quality, but people need to come together to try to get on a common page in understanding the issues and then seeing where there can be compromise, because one of the things that drives the Colorado River Basin, folks, is trying to stay out of the courts, because that takes so long and is so expensive, and try to work things through the processes of consultation, collaboration, and the like. So I think that, as I said, most likely these lessons are learned, but I think it's worth reminding people.
And so just to go back a little bit, you were talking about Lake Lanier, right outside of Atlanta, and the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint rivers, which are the subject of the dispute between Florida, and Georgia, which is still in front of the Supreme Court. So let's think about outside the United States. Can you give us an example of a wicked water problem that is being dealt with by other nations?
I'd be happy to, Todd, and I already gave a slight teaser on it in that I do work in the Israel, Jordan, Palestinian area of the Middle East. I've been there many times. I'm a student of water management there, and I speak a lot and sometimes write about the commonalities of some of the challenges of my region, particularly the lower basin region of the Colorado River and that region there. And there are many commonalities. And I think I mentioned the Colorado River being an iconic river. Well, I don't know if there's more iconic water bodies in the world than the lower Jordan River and the Dead Sea. And so there you have a situation where you have 5 riparian states that have developed the upper reaches of the Jordan River, and the flow to the lower reach below the Sea of Galilee is very, very limited. And there's been wastewater flows into it. It's been a not very healthy river system for some time. And that is the only natural inflow into the Dead Sea. So you have the Dead Sea becoming deader, declining because of such limited inflow. And that has serious, serious implications for infrastructure, for Jordan and Israel and the abutting lands there. And what to do about the water quality, the extent of the flows. Back in 2004, I believe it was, Israel passed some legislation recognizing the environment as a water-using sector. I mentioned that earlier, that, let's say in Arizona, the environment, natural systems don't have much in the way of recognition, accommodation in the state water laws. I actually wrote a paper on that called, the words in it were, I think it was Arizona and the environment, water for the environment, the forgotten sector. I mean, it's a forgotten sector. But here we are many years later, and there has been some increased flow in some years, but there have been disputes over how much water is needed for nature. You know, that's where some of the technical work of the scientists come in. And there's not necessarily agreement on that. And then there's not necessarily the water if there's so much competition for the water resources. And they've been experiencing a drier climate situation there as well. So that's truly a wicked water problem. And it's one where it's an example of, many individuals involved, multiple countries involved, affected by geopolitical issues relating to treating wastewater. And so that's a wicked problem. There is an effort to address some of it, to at least some of the Dead Sea issues and the water supply issues, through a collaborative effort to develop desalination on the Jordan side of the Red Sea. And agreements have been signed regarding that, but progress has been affected by lack of, let's say, a government in Israel that has been able to do budgeting for the last couple of years because they've gone through 3 elections and the like, and other factors. So this, even when you've identified solutions, implementing them, and they're partial solutions, not full solutions, implementing them can be very, very challenging. And so that's one of those where I say, so is there any news? What is the status? And I do have to say I haven't checked on the status in the last probably 6 months or more. So I'm not sure whether they're going forward with a desalination plant in the Aqaba region of Jordan. I know that they were very close to selecting a private company to build the plant. but I don't know if the financial aspects are all lined up. But it's very interesting because it involved a desalination plant in Jordan. Some of that desalinated water would be purchased by Israel for use in the south of Israel, which is off of their national grid for water deliveries. It would pump some the brine with some additional Red Sea water into the Dead Sea to allow study of the implications of that new water going into the Dead Sea. There are concerns about the implications of that. Scientists don't all agree on that. And so that was a pilot project. And then Israel would send more water to the north of Jordan from the Sea of Galilee. So they already have water flowing in that direction. And there would be water sold to the Palestinians, provided to the Palestinians. So it is an example of an innovative multi-party agreement by entities that sometimes cannot agree on things. And we'll have to see if it actually happens. Unfortunately, I don't have the most up-to-date information to share on that.
So I've heard from guests and colleagues that water diplomacy or hydro diplomacy is sometimes the beginning point for diplomacy between nations and many other areas of interest or mutual concern. What do you think about that observation?
There's been a lot written on that, and there's a lot of truth to that. And that's good news because these water issues need to be addressed. Water is life. People need water. Nature needs water. Animals need water. Growing crops needs water. And so from my vantage point, what I see are water experts, water managers working on addressing the problems. And I believe in many cases they're succeeding at that. At our border, the U.S.-Mexico border, people may read a lot about the tensions, the immigration issues, and so forth. There's been a tremendous amount of water cooperation going on with the Colorado River for a long time between the U.S. and Mexico. And that's managed to go on smoothly and consistently, not without burps or hiccups or whatever along the way, but it's gone on continuously through changes in presidential administrations, different policies, because water is so important. The people depend upon the managers, the decision makers for water provision. So there is truth to that. The other thing I do want to say here is that these processes that I mentioned earlier, they can evolve over time. And I've noticed that occurring both in our region, meaning the Colorado River Basin region, and also in parts of the Middle East where, let's say, the environmental community did not feel it had a sufficient voice, and yet it had studies to contribute, it had opportunities in which to take for providing input. And I've seen over time some of the processes changing where the decision makers are still the decision makers. They're not delegating their decision making, but they're taking input through a bigger table of stakeholders or processes that allow more input. And so in the last 15, 20 years, there have been really changes to the processes for looking at transborder Colorado River flows, shortage sharing issues, conservation in the Colorado River Basin, and I think in the Middle East. And so these things take time. And one of the things is for people to be persistent. Both patience and persistence are helpful, but also building the trust and mutual respect, building that is extremely important, and having the communication channels. So I would say that the opportunity to address water issues despite all the challenges, is there, but it won't be easy, and it can be expensive, and it can take a very long time.
Would you say that climate change is an aggravating factor in every wicked water problem?
Well, climate change, changing climate, whatever word you want to use, is certainly an exacerbating factor. And this is a case where not maybe, but we all potentially have a role to play in mitigation, right? If there are things we could do to reduce the problem itself, that's good. But there's also a lot of the focus has to be on addressing the symptoms, dealing with the adaptation, changing the behavior, because you're facing something now. And yes, climate change is big, and I know it's hard to get your arms around, well, what can I do as an individual? You know, it depends upon this region and that region, and decisions I have no bearing upon. But the water community must be prepared, getting back to the concept of be prepared, must be prepared to provide water, clean water, resilient supplies that can be depended upon. There's also, we have to talk about, and that's perhaps a talk for another guest for you, Todd, but the whole issue of sustainable development goals, the issue of the availability of clean water and sanitation. And I'm speaking mostly, although not totally, about areas that by and large have some dependable supply of clean water and have sanitation services. But we need to see that we don't lose ground on that and that we actually improve the status of that. And climate change is not making our job easier because of so much of the uncertainty and the issues of changing temperatures. So interestingly enough, the two areas that I've talked about today, the southwestern United States and Israel, Jordan, Palestinian area, they're both targets of climate change in terms of hotter temperatures and changing precipitation patterns, more extreme events, these flooding events that we hear about. And I don't know if others responded the same way, but we hear a lot in our region more about haboobs, dust storms. And I don't know that we hear more about haboobs because it's a new word that we're paying attention to more, or there are more of them. But I noted the derecho that affected Iowa recently. And then I've seen it come up more. It was a word that I had to look up because I know what it means in Spanish, but I don't know what it meant in terms of weather. And so I just think that we just have to look at the pathways we're identifying and water managers are identifying and look for resilient systems, knowing that we can't plan for every single eventuality, but our set of likely futures is changing due to climate change. And so we have to look at that as we plan.
So we've been talking about wicked water problems, but I think that feeds into the perception that there's much more fighting over water issues than cooperation. As a water professional, I see something different. And so I'm curious, what do you experience? I mean, obviously, disputes over water are, newsworthy and get people's attention because people, I think, are drawn to conflict, and hearing about it and all. But to me, what I see is there really is a substantial amount of cooperation going on. among various entities that share waters all over the country and many other parts of the world.
Todd, you're absolutely right. And I think there are two reasons why the conflict gets a lot of attention. And number one is that just by nature, the news sources tend to feed negative news. Fortunately, we sometimes get the good news too, but the negative news often captures the attention of the viewers and those providing news to the viewers. But also, I think the negative stories may get more attention because they have the negative impacts, and those are significant and cannot be underestimated or diminished in their importance. And so they bring to the forefront the some of the problems that we have in reality. And so they deserve to be getting attention. But what doesn't get attention are often will be the success stories or the work that it has been going on and continues to be going on to address these conflicts. And so it comes back to the fact that there are so many people working on these matters, more than I think a general member of the public could ever imagine. And the work continues, it must continue. But something that I think is important for everybody to consider when we have these conflicts is, do we have the mechanisms in place to address them? Or if we do, are they functioning well? And so there are examples of where you might have a bilateral commission or committee to deal with water issues, let's say across the Israel-Jordan border or the border of the West Bank. But yet they may go for months, sometimes, and even years without having a formal meeting. And so on paper, in Arizona, we talk a lot about paper water and wet water. On paper, you may have a mechanism, but is it functioning? Is it really working? And so that's where I keep coming back to the process as being very important. I don't mean to underestimate the importance of technology, which is, we've made great strides and we continue to make great strides. The economics factors, they're huge to consider, but they're not often the obstacle or always the obstacle. The obstacles can be the people factor, and the people factor can be because people are not able to get together because of barriers to communication, to interacting with each other, or they may be just that people haven't had the opportunity to get on the same page. So interestingly, I organized a panel last November of 2019, on implementing technology in a binational setting. And not surprisingly, the two areas I brought together were U.S. and Mexico. And in Israel and Israeli speakers, it was a little hard to get Jordanian speakers into Israel at the time, to look at implementing desalination technology across borders. And I asked them for their kind of concluding remarks or takeaways on what they thought contributed to making progress on some of these matters that might have conflicting elements to them. And one of them was functioning relationships, which I've covered, trying to identify what are the priorities and what's of value to both parties or all the parties if there are more than two, to understand that the relationships can have peaks and flows and ebbs and lows and all that. And then, being respectful of different cultures and making sure you work through the languages. But one of the things that they highlighted, and this is something that we can't do right now, is eating with your partners, getting to know your partners through sitting down over meals, over coffee, or eating with your partners. And that's something with the pandemic that we're not able to do. But again, having those respectful relationships is very, very important. So I would say that water's too big to fail. You know, there was talk in the banking industry some years ago about banks and financial entities being too big to fail. These issues are too big to fail on. We have to keep working. And so the conflicts may be there, but ultimately I think people recognize that we have to get beyond them. And we are doing, in many parts of the world and in our country, a good job of that, I think.
Great. That's great. And I just have to say that I am completely in agreement with you about the relationship building component, how that plays into people being able to work together on water issues. It's just critical.
Yeah, the relationships are so important. And people change, of course, right? Government officials in particular change. I mean, that's just part of the system. And that's where having the staff, the professional staff that don't necessarily change, that have the background, have the history, that can convey the information to the new officials as they change. And so it may be sometimes you make the multiple steps forward. Maybe there's a step back, or maybe there's just a pause as things are new people are brought up to speed. But ultimately, I think that there's great effort going on, and it just must continue.
Sharon, how can our listeners find out more about the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center?
We have a website, like every entity does these days, and the address is wrrc.arizona.edu. And I really do encourage people to visit the Water Center's site. We post just about everything we can about our projects. So our articles, our background information, our publications are listed there, except if they're copyright protected. We have a staff directory, so if people wish to contact me or other staff, we're not a big center. We're very productive. I hope people believe we're very responsive. And we put out a weekly WAVE newsletter that lists our brown bag seminars, our conferences when we're holding conferences, and other events. We have a lot of announcements there. So I would encourage people to subscribe. They'll get a weekly email, except during the summer when it's biweekly. And they should be able to find the link on the homepage, but otherwise they can just go to, so I'll say the website again, wrrc.arizona.edu, and add a /subscribe to subscribe to our weekly WAVE. And we had been broadcasting our webinars before the pandemic. Now we're only doing broadcast of webinar seminars during the pandemic, and we welcome listeners from everywhere to them, and would enjoy engaging from wherever people are.
Sharon, thank you for joining us today. I know it took a bit of effort for us to connect in terms of our schedule and the technology, but I really did enjoy our discussion.
Well, thank you, Todd. I enjoyed it too. And if there's a parting word I could give, is that our efforts, as a center, as part of a university, part of Cooperative Extension, the efforts to educate people of all ages, it never ends. And the opportunity to learn. We're always learning and we're always sharing. And I appreciate the opportunity today. And I thank you for your work and all the work you do to help further the goal of education. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I totally agree with what you just said, completely. So this has been Talk+Water. My guest today was Dr. Sharon Megdal, the director of the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center in Tucson, Arizona. My name is Todd Votteler, the host of Talk+Water. Let's talk water again soon.